Yesterday, on June 13th, a major event took place in the Ukraine war, which pro-Western mainstream media is barely covering. And in light of this predictable lack of coverage by the media, I feel that it is my duty to shed some light on what has been happening in the city of Donetsk over the last several days, and specifically what took place yesterday. So what happened yesterday on June 13th is that Donetsk city, a city of almost 1 million people and the capital of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, was subjected to an unprecedented amount of artillery bombardment by the Ukrainian army. In total, it is reported that over 300 munitions were fired onto residential areas of the city. These munitions consisted of BM-21 Grad rockets, BM-27 Uragan rockets, as well as 155mm shells, which were fired by the M777 howitzers that were so generously supplied to Ukraine by the United States. And according to multiple sources, one of which is Patrick Lancaster, an independent crowd-funded journalist who does reporting on the ground, who interviews locals, I strongly recommend everybody to go ahead and check out his channel, to check out his latest videos. According to numerous reports, including Patrick Lancaster, some of the munitions that were used in this bombardment were actually cluster munitions. I am mentioning this for anybody who has any illusions as to the fact that this bombardment was intended to kill as many civilians as possible. It is reported that as a result of this shelling, a total of 5 people have been killed and several dozen have been wounded. They are still counting the exact casualty figures. And I would like to emphasize the fact that these are the casualty figures for just one round of shelling, the round of shelling that took place yesterday. Artillery bombardment of residential areas and civilian infrastructure is nothing new for the Donbas republics. This has been happening for a very long time. Specifically, it has been happening for the last 8 years, ever since the first war that happened in 2014. And the city of Donetsk has been subject to bombardments such as this one for every single day over the last several days. And it has even been struck by more artillery shells the very next day. We learned that today, on June 14th, another round of shelling was conducted over residential areas of the city of Donetsk. And the shelling that took place on June 13th is unique only in that it is the largest ever round of shelling that has ever been fired on residential areas by the Ukrainian army ever since the start of the war way back in 2014. So what we are in fact seeing appears to be a trend of an increasing magnitude of these artillery bombardments. In other words, the Ukrainian army is firing more and more intense artillery barrages at Donetsk city every single day. And all of this goes completely unnoticed by the mainstream media, by all of the governments and NGOs in the collective West that claim to care so much about human rights and liberal values. And of course, the areas that are subjected to shelling practically every single day have zero military importance. Attacking them, bombing them, is not beneficial to the Ukrainian army from a military perspective in any way, shape, or form. There are no soldiers in these areas, there are no entrenched defensive positions, there are no ammunition depots, there is nothing even remotely of that sort. All of this is happening quite far away from the front lines in a place that the Ukrainian army cannot attack even in its wildest dreams, because I will remind everybody that we are talking about a city of 1 million people. Attacking such a city, by which I mean trying to secure physical control over such a location, trying a direct ground assault, is going to take far more manpower than the Ukrainian army has even in its wildest dreams. And this is a point that I really want to drive home to all of the people who are saying that, oh, well, the Russians are doing the same thing. This is a war. A war has no rules. You can do anything in a war. The Russian army and Donbass militias have objectively never done anything of this sort. The administrative building of the Donetsk People's Republic is being shelled practically every day. How many missiles have hit the Ukrainian Rada in Kiev? How many Russian missiles have hit Zelensky's presidential office? And frankly, I have to add that there would be some military logic for Russia to hit these targets. Frankly, it baffles me that they haven't done this 1,000 times by now. Targeting your enemy's leadership in wartime is a logical move. On the other hand, targeting random civilians, killing old men, women, children, has no military purpose. If anything, it actually does the exact opposite of bringing you closer to your military objectives. Since if you think about it, all that it's accomplishing is spending precious ammunition on killing random civilians, thereby motivating any individuals who did not yet have enough reasons to pick up a weapon and go to the front lines to, in fact, do so after their relatives or their friends have either been wounded or killed by these artillery bombardments. The Russian Air Force and the Russian Navy, with its long-range missiles, has the firepower to level many Ukrainian cities. Yet these Ukrainian cities are not leveled. And I am very specifically mentioning this point in order to dispute all of the idiotic claims that are being made up by various politicians within the collective West, by the mainstream media, that Russia is indiscriminately bombing and destroying Ukrainian cities. If such a thing was happening, if that was even remotely true, then half of Ukraine would be in ruins by now. And in the interest of fairness, I feel that I should mention that the exact same holds true for Donetsk city and the Ukrainian army. If there was some sort of general order that was handed down by either Zelensky himself or by some big Ukrainian general to shell Donetsk city and all of the other towns and villages of the Donetsk People's Republic that are within range of artillery, to shell all of these residential areas as much as physically possible, we would be seeing a lot more shells and rockets being fired every single day and a lot more devastation in these areas than we are in fact seeing. A single BM-21 multiple launch rocket system is capable of firing a volley of 40 rockets at once. So if you think about it, 300 rockets is the equivalent of 7.5 of these multiple launch rocket systems. Of course, this doesn't include any missiles that are fired by the much more powerful BM-27 Uragan. It doesn't include any of the 155mm artillery shells, but I think you get the point. Donetsk city is being shelled primarily from the town of Avdiivka, which is located right on the footstep of the city itself. This town is one of the most entrenched Ukrainian positions. Over a period of 8 years, the vast majority of the fortifications that were built by the Ukrainian army were built around this area. So attacking it head on is very difficult. And this is why the Ukrainian army is able to shell pretty much every neighborhood of Donetsk city, as well as the nearby territories that are also controlled by the Donetsk People's Republic, so often, so indiscriminately, using what are relatively short-range rocket and conventional artillery systems. Now, 300 shells and rockets sounds like the rough equivalent of what a company or two can fire within a few hours, at most a battalion. But 15,000 soldiers is more like 3 or 4 full brigades. So if all of these soldiers that are entrenched near Donetsk city were to fire all of their artillery systems to hit random targets throughout the city, we would be talking about thousands and thousands of shells being fired within a relatively short time frame. And the fact that nothing of the sort is happening is indicative that there was no general order to shell as much of Donetsk city as possible. It is much more likely that random field commanders, colonels, and other mid-ranking military officers took it upon themselves, took it to their own initiative to shell the city of Donetsk, and that the rest of the Ukrainian military apparatus either cannot stop them or simply doesn't care to even try to stop them from doing so. I think that the latter is much more likely, given the fact that these shellings have been happening, though admittedly at a much lower intensity, over the course of 8 years. So, in my opinion, this is a bit reminiscent of Ukraine's problem with far-right organizations and battalions such as Azov, Aidar, Right Sector, C-14, and so on. Not every member of the Ukrainian armed forces is necessarily a member of these far-right organizations. But the vast majority of people within the Ukrainian armed forces choose to simply tolerate these far-right organizations and to allow them to do as they please. And as a result, this vast majority ultimately becomes represented by this fringe extremist minority. I'll repeat that this is the case of the infamous far-right battalions within the Ukrainian armed forces, and it is also the case for these extremist field commanders who choose to simply let loose all sorts of artillery and rockets upon the residential areas of Donetsk city. And in fact, in both of these cases, the individuals that we are talking about might be, and in fact probably are, one and the same. In any case, these individuals are not giving the vast majority a good look. And frankly, I have to add that the majority in question is at fault for this. All it takes for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing. And in this case, these good men, who are in fact not so good, aren't just doing nothing, they are actively collaborating with the extremist elements of the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, moving on to the mainstream media coverage of this event. Of course, the pro-Russian mainstream media is talking about this very loudly, and they are rightfully outraged. The pro-Western mainstream media, on the other hand, has predictably been almost completely silent about this. I tried to Google Donetsk city shelling a few hours ago to look up any news articles on the matter, and I encourage you to do the same. All I found was a single Reuters article that was written 6 hours ago, and that article essentially very grudgingly admitted that there was indeed a very large artillery bombardment that was conducted by the Ukrainian army against residential areas of Donetsk city. And this article even mentioned, very humiliatingly for itself, that there is no independent confirmation that this shelling even took place, implying that it might be, in fact, just Russian propaganda. Even as there is footage of bodies lying on the ground, of stalls and buildings burning, of windows that are knocked out by artillery shells, of maternity wards that have been struck by these shells. Even as this volume of footage and photographs are coming out, Reuters chooses to say that, well, it might not have actually happened, it might just be, in fact, Russian propaganda, or it might have happened, we don't know either way. So that's all that we got from the rag that is Reuters. As far as the rest of mainstream media is concerned, I've heard that some other popular outlets have also published similar articles. I haven't been able to find them myself. This is just something that I heard from word of mouth, from other reports. And very notably, there was also a report in German television that reported this as a Russian artillery bombardment conducted against a Ukrainian city. And this particular report came from the German quote-unquote news agency by the name of Tagesschau. Sorry if I butchered that. German is not my native language. In any case, what this news report stated is that, and I quote, Ukraine is growing increasingly helpless in the face of widespread Russian artillery attacks. So essentially, something that is the truth if it is taken out of context, if it is perhaps a statement that was meant to generally describe the situation on the battlefield, but given the fact that they are saying this as they are talking about the artillery shelling that happened against the city of Donetsk, given the fact that they're rolling footage of the destruction and of first aid workers working in Donetsk city as they are saying this very sentence, this statement is in fact a blatant lie. A blatant and brazen lie that was said by the German mainstream media. Anyways, some final thoughts on the matter. Unfortunately, I expect these artillery bombardments to continue every single day for the foreseeable future. The Ukrainian army still has the capability to launch massive artillery attacks against Donetsk city and against some other nearby towns and villages that are controlled by the DPR, and the Russians and the Donetsk People's Militia unfortunately can't do much about it without resorting to completely flattening the cities and towns that are still occupied, or if you prefer, controlled by the Ukrainian armed forces. The town of Avdiivka and many other towns in Donbass that are still controlled by Ukraine are considered by the Donetsk People's Republics to be a part of its territory. The majority of local residents in these areas consider themselves to be separate from Ukraine. They voted to secede from Ukraine in 2014 and were only forcibly integrated back into Ukraine during Ukraine's 2014 offensive. But nonetheless, the Donetsk People's Republic still considers this area to be a part of their territory, their land, and only temporarily occupied by the Ukrainian forces. So, needless to say, they're not going to be keen on completely leveling these cities, and they are going to preserve as much of the infrastructure as possible. And the Ukrainian commanders who gave the orders to shell the city are almost certainly going to get no repercussions from the rest of the Ukrainian army for doing so. Meaning that as long as the Ukrainian army is going to have the physical ability to shell Donetsk city, which it is going to have until the Ukrainian fortification line near Avdiivka falls, which looks like will be quite a while from now, until that happens, the city of Donetsk will be periodically shelled with an intensity that is directly proportional to the Ukrainian military's physical ability to do so. So, as much as it sucks to admit it, this is the new normal for Donetsk and will be for at least a few more months. That is all that I wanted to say in this video. Thank you for listening. If you enjoy my work, please also be sure to sign up to my Telegram channel, the link to which will be in the video description, as well as in a pinned comment on YouTube. There will be regular updates that I put out on Telegram for all of my new videos, and also for various small things that are happening in Ukraine, which, quite frankly, aren't worth making an entire video about, but might be somewhat important nonetheless. That is all for now. I wish you all the best.